I'm staying. I have one more week here. I'm more pissed off than ever because I am not doing anything wrong. And, I had this sense of empowerment. Maybe some might call it entitlement, but empowerment that, I was on a mission. I believed in that mission. And I wasn't going to let these things stop me. The poverty and stress it causes on people and families, but there's also the sort of societal and political upheaval that it can create as well. Made many photographs through tears. I'm empathetic. I always say that if I had gotten into my first choice of college, which was the University of Michigan, but I didn't have good enough grades, I wouldn't be a photographer. I'd probably be like a psychologist.
What drives someone to transform a camera into a voice for those whose stories need to be told? Ed Kashi is a photographer and filmmaker whose commitment to truth and compassion sparks empathy and action. His work transcends mere images. It serves as a window into lives, struggles, and movements that shape our world. With every photograph and documentary, he amplifies the voices and stories of those often overlooked, bringing critical issues such as social injustice, political unrest, and environmental crisis into sharp focus. His lens not only captures history, but also compels us to reflect and take action. Throughout his career, Ed has pushed the boundaries of immersive visual storytelling. His work spanning decades and multiple continents emphasizes the power of advocacy and the role of photojournalism in shaping how we see and engage with the world. So, what can we learn from the eyes behind the camera? Let's meet Ed. Welcome, everyone. I am so pleased to have Ed Kashi with me today. I have had the pleasure to have a conversation with him. My nephew actually got me really intrigued with his work and who he is. And you asked me this last time, Ed, actually. How how does my nephew know you? He's going through a program at the University of Oklahoma. He's getting a master's in global affairs. And
Hmm.
one of his classes, we'll give a shout out to his professor, Dr. Rebecca Cruz, is using your book in the global social turbulence class.
Wow.
And that's how I got to even be aware of all your work. He was so intrigued. My nephew Ryan was so intrigued by you. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you, Rima. Hello.
Ed, for me, it's always a pleasure to let our listeners and viewers really know who you are. Before we go into all the incredible things that you have had the chance to touch in your work, would you take us through a little bit of your background so they really understand who you are?
Okay. So how far back do we go?
You can go as far back as you like, Ed.
Can we go 3,000 years? No, I'm joking.
Of course we can.
All right. Well, anyway, well, welcome and thank you for having me, Rima. I'm a first generation American. My mother and father were born and raised in Baghdad in Iraq and immigrated to America in 1940. And in my eyes, thankfully chose New York City to immigrate to because I got to grow up as an American and especially in a time in the 60s and 70s when it was a very hopeful time, a very exciting time, with all these progressive movements sprouting around me. Of course, there was the Vietnam War. I mean, there were dark shadows for sure cast over that period. So when I grew up, in New York as an American kid, and then discovered literature to stay connected to like what we're ultimately talking about, which is my photographic work and my work as a photojournalist and a filmmaker. Yeah, when I was about 15 or so, I discovered literature, and then my mind opened up to I want to be a writer. Well, when I got to college, I went to Syracuse University in upstate New York. It became very clear, actually, a very brutal freshman poetry professor pretty much absolved me of any idea that I might be a writer. And so, as a whatever 18-year-old kid in a panic, wondering, what am I going to do with my life? Because I did not come from a family that had money and I didn't have that to fall back on. I realized I went to a university that had one of the greatest programs in photojournalism in the world. And this is back in 1976. I mean, it's very different now. Anyway, and so for some reason, I thought, oh, if I could be a photographer, it would afford me all the things I imagined as a writer, to engage with the world, to meet interesting people, to travel, and then to be a storyteller. And so I decided to take up photography. And actually, this might be too granular, but so my dad died when I was 10. And one of the amazing things that my older sister, who's 10 years older than me, forced my mother to do is to put away money for me so I could go to college because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to afford it. So because of that, I was able to go to a private university. We could never afford it now. And anyway, so I remember, I'll never forget, I was on the phone in this sort of concrete stairwell in my freshman dorm up in Syracuse. And my brother became the, I guess, conservator of this money. He was also much older. And I remember asking him, Joe, can I have $75 to rent a camera from the Syracuse bookstore because I had never taken a picture, made a picture prior to going to college. And thankfully, he said yes. And I was able to start to learn photography. And then within a few months of learning about photographers and working in the darkroom, I just had this epiphany. I was 18 years old. I'll never forget. I know exactly where I was, this little cubby hole of a darkroom where we loaded film back then onto these metal reels to hand process. And I remember having just this epiphany in the dark that this was what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And one of the compelling reasons I think I came to that conclusion was that I had just learned about this photographer, American photographer, Imogene Cunningham, who at that point was in her 90s and was still making pictures. And I just learned about her in one of my photo classes. And I just thought, wow, if I get to live into my 90s, I could still be doing this. And so it was sort of those elements that all kind of came together for me. And that was 48 years ago. And, in some ways, the fever is as strong as ever. I mean, obviously, it's very different now. But that was really what set me on the road to deciding I wanted to be a photojournalist.
Wow.
And then after I graduated from university, I moved out to San Francisco. I had actually a very um, influential and apocryphal uh, trip to cover the Mardi Gras as a senior in college. I went with three photo buddies. We got in my old car and drove down to New Orleans. I'd never been farther west than I think Syracuse, actually, in the United States, and went down to Mardi Gras. And that was where I had this other epiphany of, wait a second, if I want to learn about the world, the last place I need to move to in a few months when I graduate is back to New York City. So I decided I'd move to San Francisco because, again, I think as I had said to you when we talked earlier, as a New York kid back in the 70s, California just seemed like some fantasy. We knew it through TV, popular music, movies. And anyway, but San Francisco always intrigued me. So we moved out there, and then that's where I began my career and
Beautiful.
my adult life.
Ed, what got you interested in the aspect of storytelling?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, again, it was through literature and kind of this idea that, you know, on the one hand, as a consumer of it, you can just get so deeply absorbed in other people's stories or other narratives. And I've come to realize that I've spent my life chasing narratives,
Mm,
basically chasing other people's narratives. And honestly, that could be like following the New York Yankees to following what's going on in the Middle East to following what's going on in my friend's life or a Netflix series or whatever it is. And I always go to that quote by Joan Didion, we live to tell stories, and we live for stories. So anyway, I think it was literature that got me sort of hooked on the idea of narratives and stories and storytelling. And then once I started to learn photography, and especially studying, photojournalism and some of the masters, I just thought, okay, this could be not only compelling but just completely absorbing. And another thing I need to go back to is back when I was like 12, 13, 14 years old, I would go to the library and I would look at Life magazines. They weren't old then,
Mm.
they were current. And again, I had no aspirations or any thought of being a photographer. I had never picked up a camera, but there was clearly something there. There was something there for me in the world of photography because I felt that was one of the first places where I got to learn about the world, looking at those amazing black and white pictures, reading the captions, reading the short essays that went along with, photo essays, a set of pictures that told a story. And for me, especially then before, the internet and social media and all these, now it's a tsunami of stories and information that we're bombarded with every day. But back then it was much simpler. And it was a much leaner media landscape. And so Life magazine and a magazine like that just really it spoke so much to me. So then once I started to learn photography and get, addicted into it, it just felt like this beautiful way to tell stories. And the other thing about photography that is different than writing, certainly, is that you have to physically be in the time and space where things happen.
Mm.
I can't rely on you telling me what happened last night or yesterday or 5 minutes ago. I need to be there. So there's this physicality and to being a photographer. And that again is something that as I did more and more of it, um, it became absorbing and addictive. And even today, there's a way that well, we can get into this, but I'm much more of a hibernator now, and that's to a large degree all that I've absorbed over the last 40 plus years. But even today, while I might not go to parties or go to certain social events or functions because I just am tapped out socially, when I get a chance to like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to go to photograph something, totally different person. I'm excited to get out in the world, and it's like having a recording device in my hands, whether it's a video camera, a still camera, or an audio recorder. It just brings me alive. And so I think, I'm clearly sort of addicted to other people's stories. And I'm not ashamed of that. No, and I think what I've come to understand is most of us are, in one way or another, addicted to that, or addicted is maybe the wrong word, but that we live for stories. And again, and I include sports in that. I didn't used to, but I've come to understand that is also a kind of a narrative and you're following a team or you're following a tennis player or whatever your sport may be that you're absorbed in, that you go with their ups and downs and the drama, the misery of losing, the joy of winning, all of those things. So I think about that a lot because it's very interesting. We talk about how we live in an over mediated world now, right? Especially with social media and these phones. But there's something about that is really absorbing and makes me feel alive.
I love the aspect of getting into people's lives, hence why I'm doing a podcast and why I ask about someone's background, because there's so much intrigue and learning to see the perspective of someone else for things that you might not have gone through yourself. So that's one of the intrigue for doing this and actually getting in touch. I'm curious, Ed, how much do you think your interest in the stories of the world and humanity and all the aspects comes from your own background of, even though you're American, but generation before wasn't in the States. How much do you think that impacted your own perspective for seeking that?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Rima, and it's something I've thought a lot about that when you examine not just the great photographers, but when you look at like who are the people that go into photography, and I speak now as someone who's also a mentor and educator globally to photographers, and it's uncanny. I wouldn't say 100%, but I bet you it's at least 80 or 90% of the people who go into this field are either immigrants, outcasts, outsiders in
Mm,
some way. So I think what it does is it makes us feel comfortable being observers, that we're
mm,
used to being sort of on the outside looking in. And I don't know, that's just my own private little not that's my theory actually in because when you look at some of the greatest photographers that ever lived, Robert Capa, he was a Hungarian Jew who had to leave during World War II, or I mean, it's endless. Robert Frank, who was from Switzerland, came to America. On and on and on. So many of the people go into this field are in some way an outsider. And what I observe as a teacher now is that so many people who are trying to become photographers or are photographers or learning, there is this element of being an outcast, of being different, and whether it's related to your gender, whether it's related to how you look, whether it's related to your sexual orientation, how you dress, your upbringing, and of course, folks who are immigrants or displaced. And so I do see there's a real connection between that sense of, as I said, being an outsider or looking from the outside in and being an observer and being a photographer. So it's really interesting because then I think about, well, when you get so good at being an observer and an outsider, how do you navigate your personal life when you don't have a recording device in your hand? And that's a whole nother conversation and subject, or that's a whole nother aspect of this conversation possibly to explore.
Definitely go whichever avenue you'd like to discuss, Ed. Very open. You're very right about individuals that feel that they're like outsiders, because I know several young individuals that are in the industry of photography, film, in some aspects or another, and they all have this desire to create an impact, a difference in the world
Hmm.
because of the things that they have lived and seen and observed, and would like to make it into something bigger. Actually, because you're a professor, would you give them a little bit of advice? Because they're starting out and Hollywood is not the scene, at least
Right.
not for the stories they would like to share with the world. Do you have some input for them before we go down the other paths?
Well, first of all, I can't say I'm a professor, but I'm an educator. But anyway,
Yes, yes.
although I take a professorial job, no, no. So I think what I always tell people, regardless of age, it's more about stage of their development in photography because they're some of the greatest photographers didn't start till they were in their 30s. So I try not to make age a part of it. But what I always say is that the key to doing especially this kind of work, it's different if you want to do fashion or portraiture or travel or food photography. Again, photography is a mass is a quite a universe, right? But with what I do, which is really people oriented, cultural, geopolitical, social, it's all focused in those areas. Um, you have to figure out what you care about. That's the source of
Mm,
your superpower. And that goes for everything in life, quite frankly. But in this case, where you're going to you're going to need to devote a lot of time and energy and empathy and research into creating a project. You might have to travel, you might have to be in situations that you're not comfortable in or that you don't necessarily like. but you've chosen this issue or this person or this place to document. So it's really important as best as you can to align what you really truly in your heart and your gut, not just your mind, what you care about. When you can align those three things, heart, mind, and gut, and believe in some issue, whatever it may be, that's the superpower, and that's where the great work will be derived from. So when you're just starting out, obviously, unless you have unlimited resources, you want to find something that is nearby geographically. Ideally, you don't have to get on an airplane, and that you so that you can have access to it and spend time to really dive in. Getting access is also a big issue with this kind of work. Often, especially in the kind of projects I've worked on, people I want to photograph or places that I want to photograph in, they don't really want me there. They don't want me to necessarily see what it is that I'm looking for. So there's that aspect as well, which even further tests your commitment, your ability to continue moving forward when you've been pushed back or slapped down or disappointed, or you've had access reneged. I've had that happen where I've had
Mm.
access denied after working for a few years on something. So, you need to be very strong. You need to really believe in what you're doing. And again, I feel that power comes from really caring about it.
That's beautiful. I'm sure you're going to save a lot of heartaches for some individuals that are looking to find their way through photojournalism and all of it.
Yeah.
Ed, you mentioned how committed you have to be, how challenging it could be to go out there and do what you do, because a lot of people don't understand the situations you're in. Would you take us through one of the things? Because you've traveled to multiple continents, you've done tons of projects. Like I said at the beginning, I came to know you because of your book, Curse of the Black Gold, which took you multiple years to work on. So, would you take us through some of the projects that you've been in, and what can we learn from that as
Yeah.
humans?
Well, let's stay with that project because you brought it up, and so it's because I've worked in over 100 countries, so there's a lot in here, and sometimes it's hard to unpack it. But so Curse of the Black Gold, which is a project I worked on for about almost 3 or 4 years in the Niger Delta, which is in the sort of the wetlands area of Nigeria. It's Nigeria is one of the 10th largest exporters of oil and gas in the world. They're a major oil country, and most of that resource is located in what is the Christian part of the country because it's Nigeria is half Muslim, half Christian. Just I have to give you these facts, and this is one of the many things I love about this work is that I get to learn and become kind of a mini expert on things. Mini being the operative word. Anyway, but that Nigeria, I think its population is 220 million people. Like one out of every 5 people in Africa is Nigerian. One out of every 10 Black people in the world is Nigerian. So this is a powerful, powerful place that also has this oil wealth. So I was turned on to this issue amazingly because I'm a baseball dad and I was living in San Francisco and I happened to be sitting at a Little League game where I was watching my son next to Professor Michael Watts, who was a professor at Berkeley, a world-renowned expert on the Niger Delta. Like, I think, yeah, he's a guy that like the government would fly into DC to get to brief them on things. So who would have thought I was sitting next to this, sweet British guy whose son was picking daisies in the outfield, like most of the kids did at that age. Anyway, and then we got to talking, and then he tells me about, what he does. I tell him what I do. I had just returned from my third trip to Iraq. This was 2003, 2004, where I had sent myself a few times to Iraq after the invasion to do some reporting there, personal projects. Anyway, and so he was like, well, mate, would you like to go to the Niger Delta? And it was one of those like, yeah, sure. Well, like 2 months later, we were together in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, working for 3 weeks on what was meant to be a project for him, looking at this place. Well, once I saw what once I like smelled and tasted and witnessed what was going on there, the gross economic inequity of a place that, could be maybe not Dubai, but is generated $1 trillion in oil wealth, and yet most of the people in that area had very little. I mean, they had the richness of their culture and their communities, but they had, no running water, no electricity, no paved roads, incredibly poor infrastructure for schools and health clinics, and all the things that we considered, civilization in a civilized society. And yet, from under their feet were, on a daily basis, millions of dollars of profits being generated, and they saw nothing of it. On top of that, their land, which, the Niger Delta, I believe, is the third largest riverine area in the world. So humongous area, that is incredibly beautiful, was being decimated. The environmental impact. There's an oil spill every day in the Niger Delta, not of the size of the Exxon Valdez, but it doesn't matter. The point is that in 1956, when oil was discovered, and then in 1957, when the Shell Petroleum Development Corporation, which was a British-owned subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell, the largest oil company at that point in the world. They might be still the largest. Anyway, when they discovered oil and started pumping it in 1957, it destroyed it didn't destroy, but it seriously impacted the agriculture and the fisheries of that region, which is what the people of that area for forever had relied upon.
Mm.
Now their waterways were ruined, their soil was being ruined, and then furthermore, and this is something that boggles my mind, and if someone out there wants to correct me if I'm wrong, I welcome it. In 50, how many years? 57, almost 60, what is that? Almost 70 years of oil works in that region. No company and no Nigerian governmental organization has built a technical institute to teach the local people to work in that industry. So it also means that it provided virtually no jobs for the people who live there. So first of all, you're stealing their patrimony, the resources that are under the grounds that their people come from. Then you're not even employing them in this industry. All right. So what it created was this incredibly fractious dynamic. And so I'm sorry, I'm really digressing here. I don't even remember what your question was.
No, no. That,
How do you get absorbed in a project?
you're
Welcome to my
doing great.
insanity. But again, this is the stuff, folks. Like, you learn these things. You can read it in a book, you can read it in a newspaper or a magazine, but when you see it with your own eyes and you see what the people are going through and how they're suffering, but you also see the magnificence of these people and their culture and their land, and then you also realize that for 300 years, foreigners have been going into this exact patch of earth. And first in the 16 and 1700s, they took people. The Niger Delta was the second largest port of exit for the slave trade. So they took their people. Then in the 1800s, it was palm oil, which basically greased the British Industrial Revolution. Then in the 1900s, in the 21st century, it's oil and gas. So I also came to appreciate that from the point of view of the Niger Deltans, I was just one of a string of people from the outside who were coming to take something. And so, again, the lessons that one learns if they have an open heart and open mind, the education that I've gotten besides the work I've been able to create, but just the education is tremendous. And it's yet another aspect of this work. But your question was, how do you navigate the ups and downs of a project, right?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, so we're going to get there now.
No, that's good. You actually are delving into
sleep.
No.
Okay, so this is talk about this. I would say that apart from conflict zones, Nigeria is the hardest place I've ever worked
Mm.
because the government, the security forces, the oil companies, even many of the villagers and the people don't want someone with a recording device. That there's just something, and I think it connects to the point I just previously made that for centuries people have come and taken stuff. It's interesting. There's so many anecdotes. I don't know tell me where to stop, but like as an
Mm.
example of that, one of the times a few years later after I finished this project and I published the book, I was commissioned to go back to the state of Bayelsa, one of the main oil producing states in the Niger Delta, to do a film. I was in a hospital, and there's this amazing female doctor who was our protagonist. So I had a mic on her, like a wireless mic. At some point, she left to go and do something, and I don't know whether she forgot that the mic was on. So I was adjusting my equipment, and then I hear her speak as she's walking away, and she said, "When these whites come, nothing good ever happens." And I'm like, oh, I'm thinking on the one hand, like, screw you. And then I'm also thinking, like, wow, right. Yeah,
Hmm.
she's, I understand. She's probably correct. And it was interesting because when she came back, I said, "Excuse me, madame, but I don't know if you know, but your mic was on and I heard you say that." And it was a classic Nigerian moment. She just looked at me and she was like, "So?" And anyway, so that's an aside. But then, okay, so literally the first trip I took with Professor Watts, like the difficulties he began before I even was out of the airport. Unbeknownst to me, as I approached, there are lines for foreigners, lines for citizens. Unbeknownst to me, as I approached the customs guy or the passport control, there was a security services guy next to him, and he was there specifically looking for foreigners that they might be concerned about entering the country. So he immediately took my phone number. I didn't know what I was doing. I was acting like a complete idiot. I gave him my cell phone number. Then the phone for the next few days started to ring incessantly, where he was like, "You need to come down. We need to look at your passport." Finally, I had to change my SIM card, and already like I was almost on the run, from the authorities. And then, thankfully, I was able to sort that out. When I returned, my third trip, I was detained by the Nigerian military for 4 days, which was probably one of the worst experiences of my life. They did not mistreat me, but it was just devastating to have all my equipment taken, to be, basically locked up, not knowing what was going to happen. If I had been a Nigerian, I could have disappeared. I had the privilege of being a foreigner, and in this case, especially an American in the context of Nigeria, they don't want problems with America. So thankfully, I was released within 4 days. But what was interesting is after that, and I got back to my compound that I was staying in, I would not stay in hotels in the Niger Delta, because one of the other things I learned in an earlier trip is every night a security guy would come and look at the ledger of the hotel to look for any foreigners. So anyway, you learn these things, right? For all the worldliness and traveling I had done at that stage in my career, I still basically stuck my foot in shit the first day, excuse me. Like I made mistake after mistake, but I learned. Like, okay, you don't fly into Port Harcourt, you fly into Lagos, all these things. You don't stay at a hotel, you stay at like an NGO compound or someone's home. But anyway, so once I was released after that 4 day detention, my editor at National Geographic was like, "So we'll get you on the next flight home." And I was like, "No, I'm staying. I have one more week here. I'm more pissed off than ever because I am not doing anything wrong." And, I had this sense of empowerment. Maybe some might call it entitlement, but empowerment that, I was on a mission. I believed in that mission. And I wasn't going to let these things stop me.
Wow. So your mission, honestly, that drove you is to be able to let the world know what's happening to these individuals in that area.
Well, and the region, not just certainly always the human part is what comes first for me, but the environment is incredibly important. And then
Hmm.
the economic aspect of, as I said, the incredible inequity. Most people in Nigeria, okay, today maybe they're living on $3 a day. Back then it was $1 a day. And meanwhile, the oil is generating, billions of dollars of profit every year. It's, I mean, we're facing this on a global scale right now, this sort of economic inequity. And, it's hugely problematic on multiple levels, besides just on the human level of, the unfairness of it, the poverty and stress it causes on people and families, but there's also the sort of societal and political upheaval that it can create as well. But the other reason that I was empowered, or I felt I wanted to do this, wasn't just to raise awareness. It was also, connected to something that had been percolating within me in my work, this idea of advocacy work, advocacy journalism. That I was also seeing that, you know, so for instance, after I finished this project, I would give lectures all over the United States, a bit in Europe. I would say how, the electricity that we are using for this projector, or for the lights in this room, or for the petrol that you put in your vehicle to get here, part of that comes from the Niger Delta. The United States takes something, I don't know what this stat now is, but back then, something like, 49% of Nigerian energy was consumed, or by the United States. So think about that. And yet, look at the way the people are living where this energy comes from. Now, it was never okay to turn a blind eye. But in a moment we're in now, where we are truly a interconnected global village, it's certainly not okay to allow this to continue. And so these are the kind of forces, if you like, that propel me to do work like this.
And I'm so curious, how do you remain kind and humane after you have photographed so many things that are going on in our world, human made, I'll call them, because they really are. How do
Yeah.
you remain kind?
Well, I just think it's in my nature. I will say that, and I don't mean that in any kind of pompous or arrogant way. I just think that's how I was raised. I was born wired to be a softie, to be, you
That's not
know,
a softie. I'm
whatever
sorry.
you want to call it.
Not a soft.
I cry quite easily. I've made many, many photographs through tears. I'm empathetic. I always say that if I had gotten into my first choice of college, which was the University of Michigan, but I didn't have good enough grades, I wouldn't be a photographer. I'd probably be like a psychologist, or a sociologist, or an anthropologist, or a social worker.
Hmm.
That clearly those were the areas that kind of jived with who I am and how I'm wired. And so the fact that I became a photographer, a visual storyteller, I bring those same values, qualities, to that work. So that means that I'm sort of wired, if you like, to deal with this stuff. But I also think that while I can certainly be manic depressive, and I'm wired in that way, I think overall I'm a positive person. And, that even for all the problems I've seen, and the horrors and all the trauma, I've witnessed so much beauty and human dignity, and, particularly human dignity and strength in the face of odds that I don't think I could have handled. And so, and then, taking that to another level, having, a mate in Julie, my wife, and we're celebrating our 30th anniversary next week. And having two kids who are now 26, 29, who, believe in me, who support me. We're blessed to have a loving family. We're not saddled with just crap between us. I mean, I'm sure there's crap. I've talked to my kids, but anyway, that basically I'm very, very fortunate and I have a strong foundation of family, immediate family, and then I'm kind of wired in this way to be empathetic. So, I think it's the combination of all those things. Therapy, actually, on and off is a part of it. Um, yeah, having people I can talk to who are colleagues that not all, but at least enough that are empathetic to this, because some of my colleagues are just not, they're not very sensitive people. But anyway, so I think it's a combination of all those elements that have allowed me to sort of survive this and not go crazy yeah, but it is hard. I mean, I mean now in a way, going back to one of my first comments about I'm much more of a hibernator now. I think that is connected to the impact of doing this work. That there's just a point where I don't really want to be around a lot of people very much anymore if I'm not working. I prefer one-on-one interactions. I prefer intimate interactions, but otherwise, I find that I'm wanting to be alone or be with my wife, with my immediate people, and not be in kind of hectic social situations.
First of all, congratulations on your upcoming anniversary
Thank you.
and
Thank you.
having a beautiful family. That makes a
Yeah.
gigantic difference. And I'd love to touch a little bit on this point that our world looks at people that are caring, that are sensitive to other people as a weakness, where in my vision, in my reality, those are the individuals that create the impact and the changes that we are all desperately looking for in our world, in our humanity. And if we cease to exist, the ones that are emotional, you'd have a very, very different world, a robotic.
Yep.
Let's not go
Ro-
down that path.
a
It is
robotic
not.
AI world.
Yes, it would not be a world where humans and humanity could exist.
That's
It
right.
just wouldn't.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful that you're very emotional. And thank you for showing up today. I really, really appreciate you and your time. Would you take me through some of the other wonderful projects that you have gone through and the current project you're working on? Because everything you touch has an impact behind it. You are there with your lens capturing things that I wouldn't have seen, I wouldn't have heard of because I can't be ever, no one can. So thanks to you and other wonderful journalists that bring us things that make us more aware of what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for all that. I mean, one of the well, it's not unique to just me, but one of the unique things about my approach is I'm not a news photographer. When you hear photojournalist, I think people think, oh, you're covering the news, which is absolutely correct. But there's another sort of element or aspect to photojournalism, which is closer to maybe what we would call documentary work,
Mm.
which is long form, in depth, so my projects have been generated over a period of anywhere from 3 to now I'm in my 11th year of a project. And so that's a defining element or quality to my work. And I'm frankly not a great news photographer because I think I get too panicky when there's too much going on. But that's another conversation. But anyway, so when my first personal documentary project of any worth was on the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, and that was really where I feel it was 1988 to 1992. So I had been out of university almost a decade, and I had started to make a name for myself covering out of San Francisco, Silicon Valley. I photographed Steve Jobs like 8 or 9 times, Bill Gates. but then I woke up one day and I was like, what am I doing with my life? I'm being published, I'm making money, I'm traveling, but I didn't want to take pictures of, CEOs in Silicon Valley. That's not why I became a photographer. I wanted to be a storyteller. So this is a really important point that I make, especially to students or young people, is that you need to be careful because it's very seductive when the phone starts to ring. Well, now it's emails, with assignments, right? It's very seductive. Oh my God, someone wants to pay me and send me someplace. And, but then if you're not careful, you can start to develop your career in a direction that isn't true to yourself. And that is actually what happened to me. So anyway, I thankfully woke up one day and realized this is no good. I'm miserable, even though from the outside it would look like I'm successful. And then I had this wonderful colleague, Andrew Ross, who actually just passed away last month, who was a writer for the San Francisco Examiner. We went to Northern Ireland together in 1988 to do a series of stories about the Troubles, as they were called, because that was then the 20th anniversary of the Troubles. And it was again similar to the Niger Delta, where I show up in this place I've not been, and my mind is blown away. I'm like by very different qualities, but this sort of dark black and white world of Belfast, and you have British soldiers and troops on patrolling the streets at that point. So it was this sort of very, I hate to use the word exciting because but very just kinetic. I don't know, it's a very interesting situation. And then I started to learn more about the Protestants of Northern Ireland and the fact that a quarter of all United States presidents hail from Ulster Protestant stock, Scotch Irish stock, from Nixon to Ulysses S. Grant to on and on and on. Anyway, and then I love Van Morrison. He comes from Belfast. So again, it's making these connections where then it's like, wow, now I'm really interested. I care about this place. I care about the history of it and what's going on there now. So my work in Northern Ireland was really the first project of any, what I view as any merit, and where I was finally making images where I looked at them and I was like, wow, okay, now there's something there finally. And it was really that body of work that then propelled me to start to work with National Geographic magazine and all the major publications. And so that was in 1991. And then it's interesting how my projects have sort of developed organically, almost one from the other. As I was finishing the work in Northern Ireland, I met this British painter, Stuart Brisley, who was married to a Turkish Kurdish woman. And she told me about the Kurds. And I was like, I never heard of these people, being a dumb American. And it's like the Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world without a nation of their own. I was hooked. I
Mm.
went back to San Francisco. I was in the library for gazillions of hours learning about the Kurdish people. I wrote a pitch to National Geographic. Thankfully, they said yes, and I was off and running. And then that became a major project, a cover story. I went to 8 countries. This was back when the National Geographic could afford these kinds of stories. They can't do that now. Anyway, and so then that was my next project. And then, again, I said, then the Kurds brought me to the Middle East. The Kurds brought me to the homeland of my mother and father, which I had no connection to up to that point. None. No resonance whatsoever with Iraq, the Middle East. All I knew is my parents and my relatives seemed to bicker a lot. But in a very
That's a
warm way.
normal way of speaking.
Exactly, exactly. But as this like kind of like so much shy, insecure American kid, I was like, ooh, that doesn't feel good. Anyway, what I didn't realize that they were just passionate. And it's a very like, culturally appropriate way of communicating. Anyway, so and then, so then from the Kurds, one project led to another, and then I was invited to photograph on the day in the life of Jerusalem, one of those, big, 100 photographers go to a place for a week and photograph it. And it was there that I realized I wanted to do something on Jewish settlers in the West Bank because again, as an American, I was like, why would you want to live in a place where nobody wants you? I
Mm,
forget the biblical stuff. I mean,
mm,
whatever. I don't mean forget it, and I don't mean to demean the importance of that to those people. But from my perspective, it was like, this makes no sense. So I spent the next 3 years developing a project looking at, the Messianic Jewish settlers in the West Bank. And anyway, so, it's just so interesting how projects sort of would come to me almost organically. And so not going through every project I've ever done, but then if we scroll forward to 2013, and I got the small commission to go to Nicaragua to work on a project, do a photo essay about this unknown disease, CKD, NT, chronic kidney disease of non-traditional causes. But I was like, sure, I'll go to Nicaragua. It sounds great. So I get there, same thing. Every day there's a funeral for a sugarcane worker from this disease. So it was once again where like reality slaps you in the face and it's like, there is a story here. There is a project here. In this case, it's underreported. In the case of the Kurds, it's underreported, really, certainly to an American audience, but underreported. The Protestants of Northern Ireland, nobody ever talked about them. If you talked about the Troubles, it was the IRA, it was the British military, and it was rightfully so, the Catholic minority who had been discriminated against, right? But you never heard about the Protestants. So here I was confronted with yet another, terrible situation, in this case related not to war, not to conflict, not to religious conflict, but to work. It was really like labor rights and health, issue of health. So that was 11 years ago. And since then, I've gone to 7 countries now and produced, 4 or 5 short documentary films, a number of photo essays. That work has been published in, major publications throughout the world. One of the films that was published in 2016 by National Geographic changed the labor practices of the largest
mm,
sugarcane mill in Nicaragua,
mm.
and where we went from being hunted down and detained by the sugar mills security people at gunpoint in 2013. In 2022, the family who owned it were inviting us for lunch. Yeah, talk about a transformation, right? So anyway, I mean, we can go on and on, but one of the many things that hearing me tell these stories is just the richness of this life, and what photography has brought to me. That whatever I've hopefully been able to bring to the world, and please, that sounds so pompous, but whatever my work has been able to do, I can I can speak very forcefully at what it has done to me and has made me a better person. And quite frankly, I think it's made my kids better people.
Mm.
Like when my daughter, who's 26, writes, her essays to get into school or whatever, now master's program, she cites that being the child of 2 journalists made her a more empathetic person, made her see things that she otherwise wouldn't have seen in a basically upper middle class New Jersey upbringing. So anyway.
Ed, there's so many questions, but I'm going to go with this one. W- We are so quick to label people in the world, whatever labels we put on them. Now that you've done so many projects and been involved with so many different countries and continents, what can you say from your own experience, like about people? How do you view people when you're sent to an area that they go, they're this or they're that, and you show up with your camera gear to present a documentary?
Yeah, oof, it's a great question. I mean, I want to avoid cliche answers here, but I would say on the one hand, and this goes, I really can't think of a place I've been to where I haven't at some point experienced this, where, you just realize that people are more or less the same, and that, they're striving for or dealing with conditions that in some ways we all deal with, um, and that there is goodness in everyone. People are not born bad, you know? I mean, I've especially seen this being able to go to like, you know, what I would consider jihadi madrasas in Pakistan or Nigeria, northern
Mm,
Nigeria, the Muslim area, where I realize like I'm in a place where these kids are being inculcated uh, um, into a way of thinking where they could be funneled into be suicide bombers. But those kids are not bad. They weren't born bad.
mm,
The people who are instructing them weren't born bad. And I know this, even that is a judgment, but anyway, so I think having seen such extremes, I've come to appreciate, um, and really in many ways fall in love with people wherever I go, kind of like really come to, as like to say when I teach, bring an open heart and an open mind to things. And yes, it's a cliche, but God damn it, it's real. And it's important to be able to do that. I mean, in every day of your life, doesn't matter whether you walk down the street for work, just to have that openness in you, because that's what allows you to greet people in a way that is more empathetic and as I love this quote, and I wish I came up with it, but understanding is the gateway drug to empathy, and that is so
mm,
true. So another way I would answer your question is, yeah, I've gone to places where I have something up my butt about those people, or that place, or that group of people in that place. I'm ready. Actually, quite frankly, the Niger Delta is a good example. I went in there with the knives out for the oil companies, Shell and Chevron and Exxon and BP and all. And then you get there and you realize, wait a second. First of all, we all need oil and gas, whether we like it or not, until we smarten up and get our acts together and move away from fossil fuels.
mm,
That resource has to come from somewhere. And there are people and engineers and corporations who are doing, man on the moon level engineering work to get that resource to us
mhm,
so we can have the energy we have to do what we're doing right now. And so that's another thing where you gain this wider appreciation for how the world actually works. So anyway, so I'm getting lost in all of this. So please reel me back in. But you know, anyway, so then, I get to the Niger Delta, I see the reality on the ground. And yes, the oil companies could do a much better job. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's tremendous fault with them. But what I kind of came to see, it was really the Nigerian government that bears the greatest responsibility, because they're the ones who should be protecting their natural environment, the patrimony of their people, their people. They should be building the hospitals and the clinics, not asking the oil companies to do, which they do in a half-assed way. So then you start to sort of see the nuances of things. So again, I'm digressing from your very, very good question and very important question, but I guess I've come to try to and actually, you know what? I have an even better example. I'm working on a project right now with my wife, a book project looking at America and how is America divided, or is America really as divided as we believe? We believe we're not as divided, quite frankly, as certain politicians and the media makes it out to be. I'm not saying we don't have problems and there
mm,
aren't terrible divisions, but in general, Americans work together in a beautiful way for the most part. Anyway, so we've been going to Texas and Mississippi and Orlando. Now, as a liberal New Yorker or New Jerseyan, I could go to those places and be ready to look down upon them or whatever, whatever, whatever. Well, again, you get there and you just realize like these people are amazing. Their culture is so rich. Yeah, I might not agree with their politics, but it's like we met a Trumper in the Mississippi Delta who's a pothead. and whose son has like the only dispensary in their town, for weed, or a Moms for Liberty woman in Florida who said privately, "Don't tell anyone, but I voted for Biden." Even though it would be so clear she would be a MAGA person. Again, what I'm getting at, and I'm sorry to bring up these more partisan things vis-a-vis the United States, but it's this idea of open heart, open mind. Yes, we might disagree on things, you know, but there's so much more that we have in common, but we can't reach that. We can't reach that unless we are open to it. So yeah,
Thank you for that. Thank you very much for
you
that.
didn't ask for all this, no.
No, no, I did ask for all of this, and I'm grateful that you're actually providing all of this. Ed, we talked a little bit, and I say a little bit because there's so much to cover for you about the projects you've done. But now take me within your own life because you mentioned it earlier. When the lens comes off, what does that do for the person that is in front of me right now for your life?
Yeah. Well, this is a very addictive, I've used this word, but it's true. In this case, this is correct use of it. It's a very addictive form of work. No wonder so many people who do this work, become destroyed by drugs or alcohol or, you
Mm.
know, whatever. They can't keep a marriage together or be proper parents or even be parents, that this work takes a big toll. And so, um, for me, I guess I don't know. Let me see. How do I put this? I need you to ask the question again.
Taking off the lens of the photographer and everything that you have lived through and grown through in all these assignments,
Yeah.
how does that come back to you living your own life and how do you show up as Ed?
Yeah. So again, this work is really addictive, and what happens is if you're not careful when you're not working, you can plunge into a depression or
Mm.
a kind of, I guess you'd even take it down to the physiological, like you're used to having these endorphin rushes all the time.
Mm.
And you don't have to be covering war.
Hmm.
And honestly, I could go to, like I'm working on a project right now about a Filipino dance company in New York. And every time I go to see them, I'm full of endorphins because it's so beautiful and they're so cool and it's so exciting, it's so beautiful, right? Well, anyway, so what happens when the curtain falls? What happens when you don't have that camera in your hand and you're just alone or you're not, well, what often can happen, and I've certainly battled this, is for me a tremendous like sort of manic depressive state, where I get the call or I decide to go and do something and I'm up and I'm juiced, and then I come home and I finish the work, and then it's like you sort of plunge into this, who am I, what am I doing with my life, or it's just a lack of endorphins. It's as simple as that. Like it's just on a chemical level. Even if the rest of my life is objectively okay, I still often did not feel good. And it was really hard in the teen years with my kids because I took a lot out on them. I would come home and I'd come back from Afghanistan or Iraq or Nigeria, and I'd be angry and just pissed off. And I definitely took it out on them. I never physically, but more than I should have. And that's required a certain amount of, rehabilitation work, especially with my son. And we're in great shape. And, there's nothing like talking openly and listening. Those are the keys to a good, long, healthy relationship with anybody. To be able to listen and to be able to be heard, but also know that they have been heard. So anyway, so we've been able to work through this stuff within my family, but it was tough. There were times where Julie would just look at me and go, "Who is the baby in this house?" Or there were times where I literally had to leave the house and drive away or walk because I couldn't take it anymore. I'd come back from like being deployed in Afghanistan for the New York Times Sunday Magazine, with the U.S. military, and 24 hours later, I'm home at the dinner table, and nobody is asking me about Afghanistan, about my experience, about what I saw, and then I'd be like, "What the hell?" But then, as my wife said to me, that was a healthy sign because it meant that our kids are okay, that they're in their lives and they're okay. They're secure. So, I mean, I have to give so much credit to Julie for sort of not only sticking with me, but sort of teaching me over the years. She had that wisdom, because I came from a broken family. As I said, my dad died when I was 10. My mom tried to commit suicide afterwards, and she was just never the same. So, I kind of had to raise myself in a way. And, but I'm very fortunate that I ended up with a woman, with a person who came from a good family and understood what it, she taught me what it looked like to have an okay family. And that in large part is what has saved me.
Ed, thank you for sharing all of that, honestly, because there's so many people that look at someone's life, especially someone like you who's published and has all these accolades, and they tend to believe that everything is great in that person's life
Yeah.
without really understanding that in our human journey, we all have our own battles that we're working through to become better human beings. And you having your wife Julie there to be a little more emotionally intelligent in areas that you hadn't reached. And especially you touch on something that is so big when you're working in a certain field or doing a certain something and you see things that someone else hasn't seen, hasn't heard, doesn't even understand. And you come back with that because that's now become a little bit a part of you.
Yeah.
How does that person even begin to associate and talk with you? And I'm saying it from a perspective, there's a lot of kids that think that their parents don't understand them and this is happening. It's like, that's true. They don't understand you. And unless you communicate, you can't
Exactly.
get someone to understand you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's interesting. I don't know why it made me think of this, but so Julie's dad was, World War II veteran, and he was typical of that generation of men who never talked about what they did. They didn't talk about anything, quite frankly, except maybe sports scores. Anyway, and he died in 2008, but recently Julie found out, and he never said that he saw combat. Sorry,
Mm,
that's the point. It was always like, oh yeah, I was in France and Italy, but he never talked about it. Well, she found out in the last year that he had like a Purple Heart and like, clearly had been in combat. But his generation of men, and this is not a good thing for them or for all of us, didn't talk about that stuff. Well, I'm a part of a generation. Do we call ourselves narcissists? No, I'm part of a generation where, or a time where we are more open, especially men are more open, and also there's the room for it as well. I think that generation, they probably a man might have been looked down upon if they talked about whatever their PTSD or whatever it is. So in that sense, we're in a much healthier place, but it also means that there's a lot more to deal with. There's a lot more information that we all have to process from our loved ones or our colleagues or in a professional setting, whatever. So it's yeah, I'm not sure why I said that, but something you said made me think of her dad and just how much things have changed um and yeah, and I can't imagine doing this and not having family because it's also very lonely. This is a very lonely field. Sorry, I don't mean to make this such a downer.
no, 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 but it's the truth because I see that. I mentioned it before we got on that I have a lot of young individuals that are in the film industry or acting
Yeah,
industry, and in between jobs, it really is very challenging for them to maneuver around what else can be created and how do they show up
yeah,
when the projects aren't there. So you're almost living like two lives.
yeah, yeah. And these are highly competitive fields. So it's not like there's a lot of love out there. Even as someone who's highly successful, the majority of my life is rejection and disappointment.
That's good
Uh,
for them to know that even someone that is very successful does get rejected.
so I'm reading this book now by David Brooks, the columnist for the New York Times, about character, and
Hmm.
it's I love these sorts of books, but he's going through all these different people in history. And I just read a passage about Dorothy Day, who most people probably never heard of, but she was a California born. She became a journalist and then she devoted her life to the Catholic Church, but was very much, um, she used it almost like a Mother Teresa
Hmm.
figure, but also a journalist and started a newspaper that had like 300,000 circulation anyway. But one of the passages in the piece about her was talking about the importance of suffering and that how, especially in the Western mind, we're geared towards happiness, and I think maybe Freud was one of the first, and he talks about that to sort of distinguish between sort of the Western person, seeking happiness. And what Dorothy Day and her story and what David Brooks was trying to bring to light through it was this idea that character is built through suffering. It is not built through being happy. And that doesn't mean that suffering isn't a disease. It's a condition of being alive, that everybody suffers in some way or another. And so it really touched me last night reading that, because I take great solace in that personally, but also it's really it's instructive on so many levels, because especially the culture in the United States is so geared towards avoiding all that. So anyway, there's another little nugget.
I love that, honestly, because you're speaking the language that I love for people to understand, that the cultures make a gigantic impact
Yeah.
on how we show up in the world. Just like you said, you've traveled and you've been treated a certain way or looked at a certain way. Every culture has its nuances. What have you learned from the lens of your camera for us to get along a little bit better?
Hmm. Can I have overnight to think about that? No, no.
Say
Um,
whatever you like, Ed, because really,
yeah,
you've been in places that most people will never see in their lifetime. And you've been in rough spaces and you've been in happy spaces.
yeah. When I think about it, when I think about the answer to that question, I think at the heart of it, it's connected to biases, to bias, whether it's implicit or not, um, and how the media and people like myself can have either a very positive or very negative impact on that. So I think a lot about how up until maybe 10 years ago, every time I went like to Nigeria, let's just say, I don't mean to pick on Nigeria, it's such a powerful place and it holds such a place in my life. But, I would never take a picture of a Nigerian man smiling,
Hmm.
because I thought, oh, well, that picture is not going to be it's not going to have an edge to it. It's not cool. It's not gutsy. It's not tough. It doesn't make me look like I'm a tough photographer, right? Even though 90% of the time Nigerian men are smiling and making jokes and are like super ebullient, right? I mean, again, gross generalizations, but to some degree true. But when they suddenly became mean or were serious, whoa, that's when my camera went up and I captured them. Well, thankfully, about 10 years ago, I started to understand this idea of these visual tropes, you know, all Muslims are this, or all Africans are that, or all Americans are, are sexually perverted and have guns and like it's classic actually European publications in all my career. That's all the stories they always want to do about America, about violence, about sex, about perversion, right?
Mm.
And then there was a point where I realized, like, as an American, it's like, I don't like that. We're more than that. Well, in the same way that obviously not all Muslims are terrorists and not all Africans are poor or angry or violent, but these are really essential lessons that we need to carry forward as journalists and as storytellers. And connected to that, which is happening in a beautiful way at the same time, is the proliferation of diversity of voices. So that now increasingly you don't need me to go to Nigeria to tell their story. There are amazing Nigerians who are, well, certainly writers. I mean, Nobel laureates, that's not new, but photographers and visual artists and storytellers that are making incredible work, and that express their culture and their place in the world in a much richer and frankly more interesting way than I do, than I might. I might be able to go in and take like a slice of that reality and report on it, accurately or as accurately as I can. And it is truthful and it's instructive and all those things. But it's a very narrow band view. So anyway, so to get back to your question, in a way, how do we come together more or how do we
Get
find
along better.
get along better? It's not, you know, it's not thinking that everybody from the South is dumb and backward. And it's not thinking, I'm Stephen, sorry I am saying these things because when you say them, they become true. But it's basically getting away from the cliches and the biases and the tropes that in many cases we are unwittingly being educated by.
Very well said, Ed. Very
So
well
that
said.
puts the onus on journalists and photographers and filmmakers to really check their biases, check their storytelling and make sure, especially if you're the outsider view, which is super important and valid, especially, obviously with the insider view, that's an interesting thing to explore. Like if an insider paints their people in a certain way that we might view as discriminatory or derogatory, that says something too, right? Anyway, but I think that would be the overarching thing is we really need to check our biases as reporters and as storytellers and make sure that we're not reinforcing things that the stereotypes that are just destructive or detrimental because that is what creates these divisions or sort of maintains these us versus them mentality.
That's the right thing, the us versus them. And
Yeah,
I would add to your list social media figures these days that
totally.
have platforms and
Yeah.
people are listening to them. And is there
And
still a,
politicians who are being incredibly irresponsible. Incredibly irresponsible.
I'm just shaking my head at that.
Yeah.
And is there any place still in our world that you would go? I really would like to go and learn more and cover this.
Um, a place I haven't been.
Or a place you have been that you go, I'd love to still go back and do something and learn more about this.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's such a tough question because there's too many answers to it. Uh,
Mm.
I don't know. I've never been to Indonesia. I've always wanted to go to Indonesia, but
Mm.
not because of some pressing issue. Um, but I would say, it's probably places I'd like to return to because you know, one of the things that I look at now when I look at my work is there's a number of the projects that I've done I would not be able to do today because of a deterioration in the security situation.
Mm.
I could never do the same work in the Niger Delta now. I could never do some of the work I've done in Pakistan or, in the Middle East. But I would love to return, I would love to return to Iraq. I would love to return to um, um, Pakistan. I find, frankly, I am intrigued and by the Muslim world, and I feel that it's kind of one of the yawning gaps that is getting worse, and it needn't. And so anything that could bridge that gap or stop it from cleaving even to be even bigger, to me, might be one of the most important, besides solving climate change and finding a limitless source of renewable energy, which I really truly believe is the salvation of humanity on this earth. I
Hmm.
really, because
Hmm.
if we can solve that, a lot of other things will be healed. But other than that, it's really figuring out how to stop this sort of hemorrhaging of, Islam versus the West, for lack of a better way of putting it. Because what I have witnessed in my years worth, literally years worth of time living and working in Muslim countries, is a kind of a beauty and a kind of a safety, a dignity that is so powerful and so beautiful. And again, going back to your previous question, how do we promote those qualities? How do we promote the good things or highlight the good things that are happening, the positive qualities of places and peoples and cultures and religions? Because so often, the media, they trade on the worst
Hmm.
information, in the worst news. And while I understand why, and I know it sells, if it bleeds, it leads, all that crap is true, unfortunately, to an nth degree now because of social media. How do we rein that in? How do we find a way to tell good stories about other people and other places, and be celebrated for it? If I may, that gets to a really important point within my little profession, which is, and this was mentioned years ago by Stephen Mays, who's a great thinker and formerly ran our agency, Seven Photo, where he talked about how, all the major photo contests, the World Press out of Amsterdam or Pictures of the Year out of Missouri, the people that win those awards, and I'm included, there's guns, there's bleeding, there's violence, there's conflict. Other than sports, or portraiture, you don't get awarded for doing some incredible story about some life affirming element
Hmm.
of a place or a people or a culture. And so he said that, as he rightly stated, that if that is the message, then if you're a young person entering the profession, the message you're being given is, I've got to look for the bad things in the world if I want to succeed. And so while I believe the younger generations have almost auto corrected some of that, and I praise them for that.
Hmm.
Praise them for that. I praise them for pushing me in those directions and showing me that there's a different way that this needs to be done. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done within our professions in the media to sort of, what I see, correct what is in a way a very almost self-defeating, not self, but like human defeating
Hmm.
quality to our media.
Incredible point. Incredible point, Ed. I have a couple more questions for you, but before we go further, how do people get in touch with you? What's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, I mean, email, I'm ed@edkashi.com, or certainly, DM me through Instagram. I'm Ed Kashi. But I would say those are the two ways.
Right. Um, what is your role in the seventh agency? What is the whole purpose of the seventh agency?
Right. Well, it's gone through a lot of incarnations.
Hmm.
So it was literally founded 2 days before 9/11. I don't know if you know that, but
Mm-mm.
in Perpignan, France, which is where certainly the most important and famous festival for photojournalism in the world, takes place every sort of September around Labor Day. Um, and a group of photographers who were there decided to form this agency. They'd been talking about it for a while. And then literally 2 days later, 9/11 happened.
Mm,
So anyway, so when Seven was originally formed by the seven founders, and I'm not one of them, um, it was really predicated on the idea that the media and the world was changing with the digital revolution, especially impacting photojournalism. And we needed a new model for how photojournalists could operate, disseminate their work, and make a living at it. And so when Seven burst on the scene, they skyrocketed to prominence and importance, really kind of led the way. I mean, for those of you who know about photography, Magnum is still the oldest and greatest photo agency. To me, Magnum is part of the human patrimony. I mean, the photographers they have there, the archive alone is something to be cherished and preserved. I mean, just that, full stop. Anyway, so but even Seven was influencing Magnum at that point. Um, and then over the years, Seven has evolved and changed. And now, most recently, in the last year and 2 years, um, in large part because of the brilliant vision and guidance of Gary Knight, who was one of the founders, um, what we basically did was we dissolved Seven Photo LLC. That agency doesn't actually exist as a business anymore. It exists as an entity, right, and as an idea. But the Seven Foundation is now what exists, is the structure that exists going forward. And what is so beautiful about it, and the changes that it augurs. And again, already another big agency, Noor, based in Holland, has followed us in this example. Is photographers no longer have to pay monthly dues. Photographers no longer have to pay to become a member if you're voted in. When I was voted in, I had to pay a huge amount of money because I was becoming a part owner. It was a cooperative. Well, now none of those structural things exist, which means we can now have a photographer from, Dhaka or from Saigon or from Kolkata who can't afford to pay $300 a month or $30,000 to become part of this silly little club. They can now be a part. So we can have incredible talent
mm,
from places that would in the past um, never been able to access major media in the West, or never been able to be seen and have their work disseminated without the financial burden.
mm.
So that's a beautiful element of this structural change. And then just moving forward, it means that on a almost like ethos level, like a spiritual level, it's about teaching, and it's about working on projects that are of social and geopolitical significance. But teaching is a huge part of Seven now. I would say that's probably the biggest part of the Seven Foundation. And we now have two brick and mortar academies in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Arles, France,
Mm.
and people who apply, they're specifically for majority world photographers. So anyone who applies from the majority world, right, the developing world, if you get in, it's free,
So,
tuition free,
mm,
and your travel, room and board are covered. So
right.
this is, to me, reflects the level of commitment that we are now showing, not showing, that we are executing to photographers from places that in the past were completely excluded from the conversation in the world of photojournalism.
So you really are opening doors and opening hearts with
Absolutely.
especially that step of
Yep,
opening it to everyone that can join you guys.
exactly.
Ed, is there anything that you'd like to say that I haven't asked you? So we don't get off this podcast and go, Rima didn't ask that.
I don't know. I feel like we've talked about a lot, and I think your questions are beautiful and so meaningful and spot on. I think I feel like really good about this, and I just urge people to put aside their differences and really look at other people with that openness. And it's amazing what you'll learn and what you'll see.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Ed. Ed, I really
Um,
appreciate you. And
okay,
I'm
thank you
grateful
so
for
much.
giving me your time. And to our viewers and listeners, please remember our attitude always determines our altitude in life. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you in the next podcast. Thank you, Ed. And I love you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Lots of love.